In ancient Nubia, along the banks of the Nile's southern stretches, a kingdom emerged that would be remembered not for its gold or temples, but for its discipline. The ruler at its center was King Akar-Nesut, a man born not of royal blood, but of military command. His rise from soldier to sovereign reshaped the desert tribes into a unified power that commanded fear and obedience across the sands. Guys, can you help me to hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel? And it's my dream. Sorry for interruption, it's humble request, let's jump into the video. Akar-Nesut first gained recognition during the campaigns against the Eastern raiders, who sought control over the Nubian salt routes. He was known for strategy rather than strength, preferring attrition over open warfare. He ordered salt pits to be flooded to trap enemy soldiers, creating deadly marshes of blinding salt crystals. Victories in those campaigns won him prestige among nobles and loyalty among soldiers. When the old king of Nubia died without an heir, the Council of Elders chose Akar-Nesut as the regent to maintain order. Within months, he consolidated full control, abolishing the council's authority entirely. His coronation marked a turning point as he began transforming the once divided land into a centralized kingdom guided by law, trade, and control over resources. Under his rule, salt became not only a commodity, but a symbol of wealth and order. He established the Salt Guild, a royal institution responsible for taxation and distribution of salt throughout the region. Every caravan that crossed Nubia's borders paid tribute in salt, ensuring the kingdom's economic supremacy over its neighbors. Akar-Nesut's governance was administrative rather than indulgent. He constructed fortified depots near the salt mines of Gebel Barkal, guarded by elite soldiers known as the Desert Spears. These outposts served both as trade stations and as military checkpoints to control smuggling and rebellion. The king's strict regulations on trade made him both respected and feared. He introduced a census to monitor the laborers working in the salt fields, documenting each miner's lineage and productivity. Those who exceeded their quotas were rewarded with cattle or land, while underperformers were reassigned to harsher tasks. This system created a disciplined workforce, reducing rebellion and ensuring efficiency in production. Despite his military origin, Akar-Nesut promoted learning. He invited scribes from Egypt to record trade agreements and translate royal decrees into hieroglyphic and Meroitic inscriptions. These inscriptions glorified his reign as one of divine order, portraying him as a guardian of the land's purity and balance. His temples were modest but symbolic. He avoided gold-plated shrines or excessive ornamentation, favoring sandstone pillars engraved with images of rivers, salt blocks, and the blazing sun. These represented sustenance, trade, and power, the pillars of his kingdom. The people referred to him as he who measures the desert, a title signifying his control over both the land and its people. While his reign brought stability, it also enforced silence among dissenters. Surveillance extended deep into villages, with informants ensuring loyalty. Public assemblies were discouraged unless sanctioned by the state. The king's philosophy was that rebellion began in words before it reached weapons, so he sought to eliminate its roots early. His court functioned like a machine of precision. Every judgment, decree, and tax record passed through his council of scribes. Punishments were standardized according to offense and rank, and appeals were rare. Akar-Nesut believed that mercy disrupted order. To him, discipline was the true measure of a ruler's virtue. Foreign envoys described his capital as austere yet efficient. Roads connecting trade routes were paved with compacted salt and stone to prevent erosion. Even his royal guards maintained polished shields coated with salt layers to resist corrosion in the desert heat. Salt became not only a resource, but a motif embedded into every aspect of his administration. Relations with Egypt fluctuated between alliance and tension. While trade thrived between their ports, Akar-Nesut resisted Egyptian religious influence. He rejected the deification of pharaohs, insisting that no man could claim godhood. Instead, he was portrayed as the steward of balance between the living and the desert, protector of Nubian purity. Over time, his rule expanded southward into smaller desert communities. He offered them protection in exchange for tribute. Those who refused were not destroyed, but absorbed economically. Salt became the instrument of assimilation. Through trade monopolies, he made these tribes dependent on his kingdom for preservation of food and life. Inside his palace, the administration of salt was handled with precision. Tablets recorded each shipment, weight, and destination. Inspectors visited mining outposts monthly to ensure compliance. The penalty for tampering with royal records was severe, but not yet the horror that would later define his rule. His punishments were still pragmatic: fines, labor, and exile. The king's personal life remained private. He never took a queen, though he fathered 2 sons by concubines from eastern tribes. Both were educated by scribes and trained in governance rather than war. Akar-Nesut desired heirs who would preserve order, not chase conquest. His focus was sustainability, not expansion. Religious life under his rule changed subtly. Temples once dedicated to river gods began incorporating the imagery of salt as divine matter. Priests spoke of salt as the body of the desert, pure, eternal, and unyielding. This spiritual association strengthened his control, tying economic power to religious reverence. As years passed, the king's influence extended beyond politics into daily existence. From the food that was salted in households to the mummification of nobles using imported salts, his name became synonymous with preservation. Akar-Nesut viewed this as symbolic of his governance, preserving order against decay. Visitors from distant lands, including Greek merchants, recorded his meticulous management and the discipline of his people. They described Nubia as a realm of silence and precision, where even the wind seemed measured. They noted the absence of rebellion, but also the absence of joy. It was a society of endurance, not freedom. In his later years, the king became increasingly occupied with the idea of legacy. He commissioned records of his reign to be carved into temple walls, emphasizing justice, order, and purity. The texts depicted him as the bringer of balance between the Nile and the desert, a ruler whose will kept chaos at bay. Yet beneath this veneer of order, seeds of fear began to grow among his subjects. The miners whispered about punishments that had become more severe. The desert spears were said to have constructed secluded compounds in the western dunes. Few knew their true purpose, but soon those who defied the Salt King would come to understand the cost of rebellion in ways history would never forget. The reign of Akar-Nesut entered its second decade with unmatched control over the Nubian trade routes. Yet as his rule matured, so did his obsession with absolute order. The once administrative system of discipline turned into an ideology of purification. To him, corruption was decay, and decay was treason against the desert itself. The king began to view punishment as not only a deterrent, but a process of preservation, a method to maintain the moral integrity of the kingdom. It began quietly, in the mining settlements near Gebel Barkal. Reports of theft and sabotage among laborers troubled the king. He sent investigators who discovered that workers were hoarding salt for private trade. Instead of traditional penalties, Akar-Nesut ordered an experiment in deterrence. The offenders were bound, coated in oils, and buried in chambers lined with salt crystals. Their bodies were left under the desert sun until they hardened into lifeless figures. This marked the first recorded instance of the salt tombs. The king described these actions as returning corruption to purity. The combination of salt, oil, and heat desiccated flesh and preserved form. To his mind, it symbolized the eternal stillness of obedience. The preserved bodies were later displayed near mining roads as warnings. Laborers passing by them each morning worked in silence, knowing the fate that awaited defiance. Word of these tombs reached the capital. Some ministers questioned their morality, but none dared to confront the king directly. He declared the practice lawful through a royal decree, stating that salt shall guard the realm as it guards the flesh. The decree institutionalized preservation as punishment, integrating it into the kingdom's legal code. From that point, all acts of rebellion, espionage, or corruption within state affairs were subject to this process. The Salt Guild, once a commercial institution, transformed into an apparatus of enforcement. Overseers were trained to identify disobedience, and executioners were instructed in the technique of preservation. The method required precision. the condemned were first cleansed with river water, then coated in resin and mineral oil to prepare the skin. Next, they were covered with layers of powdered salt until every surface was sealed. The process took days, and exposure to the desert heat ensured that moisture was completely drawn from the body. Those who witnessed the procedure noted its silence. There was no fire, no blood, no open suffering, only stillness. It appealed to Akar-Nesut's belief in control. He often said that chaos left noise, but order left silence. In time, he began attending the early stages of these rituals to observe the discipline of his guards and the precision of the process. Records found in later centuries described entire courtyards filled with these salt-preserved bodies. Some were displayed upright, seated in traditional postures of submission. Others were placed within chambers designed to resemble small shrines. Their preservation was near perfect, the salt preventing decay and insects. Archaeologists, centuries later, would mistake some of them for artistic sculptures until further examination revealed the truth of their origin. The salt tombs became a political instrument as well. Nobles who attempted to conceal wealth or interfere with trade quotas were accused of disrupting the realm's purity. Once convicted, they were subjected to the same fate as commoners. The king's justice made no distinction between class or birth. In his view, decay came from within, and any rank could harbor it. Over time, the rituals surrounding the tombs evolved. Priests from desert temples were assigned to oversee the process, invoking purification chants as they anointed the condemned. Salt was no longer seen only as a material, but as a spiritual medium that separated the impure from the eternal. Offerings of dates and incense were placed near the tombs to appease the spirits trapped within. The practice blurred the line between punishment and preservation, merging justice with theology. Foreign visitors were disturbed by what they saw. Egyptian traders referred to Nubia as the land of still men. Some accounts mention roads lined with preserved figures, their features frozen in lifelike calm. To outsiders, it was an unsettling sight, a landscape turned into a gallery of silence. Yet within Nubia, the display reinforced obedience. The people believed that those sealed in salt watched over the kingdom, guarding it from internal decay. The king's administration expanded the practice into state ceremonies. Each year, during the Festival of Preservation, new tombs were sealed under royal supervision. Officials and soldiers attended to renew their oath of loyalty. The ceremony symbolized continuity, the living reaffirming devotion before the preserved dead. The line between justice and ritual had dissolved completely. Among the scribes, records began to shift in tone. Royal inscriptions no longer emphasized prosperity or trade, but purity and permanence. The temple carvings depicted figures dissolving into salt under the rays of the sun, with inscriptions praising Akar-Nesut as the hand that guards eternity. The kingdom's identity was no longer tied to commerce, but to preservation itself. However, beneath this structured surface, unease began to grow. Families of the condemned sought to recover their relatives' remains, but the law forbade it. The preserved were property of the state, declared as eternal sentinels. Discontent spread quietly among miners and traders, who feared that even a minor mistake could lead to entombment. Whispered dissent emerged, though none dared to voice it openly. The Salt Guild's inspectors became instruments of terror. They visited settlements unannounced, inspecting records, measuring yields, and questioning workers. A missing block of salt or an incomplete ledger entry could lead to accusation. Accused workers were taken to the desert compounds from which none returned. The once prosperous salt fields grew quieter, haunted by the presence of those who had been transformed into monuments. Over time, the king's obsession extended beyond punishment. He ordered his scholars to experiment with new mixtures of salt and oils, seeking longer preservation and greater hardness of form. He called this process the eternal flesh, believing it could make his legacy indestructible. The line between ruler, scientist, and zealot blurred as he pursued control over mortality itself. The salt tombs of Nubia had begun as a deterrent, but became the foundation of an ideology. To Akar-Nesut, the state itself was a body and its people were its flesh. Salt was the agent that kept this body from decaying. Rebellion, corruption, or doubt were diseases to be dried and preserved before they could spread. His ministers, fearful yet obedient, carried out his will with precision. By the end of the second decade of his reign, the landscape of Nubia bore the marks of his rule. Across the desert, white figures stood motionless under the sun, their surfaces glistening with salt crystals. To travelers, they appeared as sentinels guarding the trade routes. To the Nubians, they were reminders of the king's will, a silent testimony to the price of disobedience. The kingdom functioned efficiently, but the air was heavy with restraint. Markets operated, caravans moved, and temples thrived, yet an invisible boundary surrounded every action. Akar-Nesut had achieved complete order through preservation, but as the sun hardened the desert and the salt consumed all traces of life, the same silence that had once symbolized peace began to echo with the weight of fear. In the later years of Akar-Nesut's reign, the kingdom of Nubia appeared unshaken from the outside. Trade continued, roads remained clear, and the capital glowed with white stone polished by salt dust. Yet within the walls of order, unrest began to crystallize. The very system that had built his empire now suffocated it. The laborers in the salt fields were dwindling. Desert winds carried whispers of revolt. The king, however, interpreted silence as loyalty, unaware that it had become the stillness of fear. The Salt Guild, once his instrument of purity, grew corrupt under its own power. Inspectors began accepting bribes, preserving innocence and condemning rivals. Reports reached the capital of falsified records and vanished shipments. When confronted, the guild's overseers deflected blame onto one another. Akar-Nesut, perceiving this as decay within the institution he created, ordered the preservation of every senior officer involved. Entire halls of administrators were sealed in salt chambers, transforming bureaucracy into another tomb. The economy soon fractured. Without experienced overseers, the salt production fell drastically. Trade caravans found the roads unguarded, and neighboring tribes began raiding shipments. The kingdom's lifeblood, the very salt that had symbolized eternity, became scarce. Grain prices soared and famine crept into the desert settlements. For the first time in decades, the people began to speak against their ruler. Even the priests who once praised him as the hand that guards eternity began to question his vision. They argued that preservation without renewal was not life, but stasis. The temples of Gebel Barkal saw offerings decrease, and processions to the capital grew rare. The king, aging and isolated, refused counsel. He saw dissent as infection and intensified his purification campaigns. His guards filled the roads once more with preserved figures, this time priests, merchants, and scholars. When his eldest son Karam quietly opposed the practice, the king accused him of weakness. The young prince was stripped of title and exiled to the southern frontier. His departure marked the first visible fracture within the royal household. Without his heir's guidance, the king withdrew further into solitude, confiding only in scribes who recorded his visions of eternal order. But decay reached even the palace. Salt dust corroded the walls, and storage vaults cracked from overexposure. Statues of preserved rebels, once proud symbols of power, began collapsing under the weight of centuries of sun. The air grew thick with the stench of minerals and age. Nature, indifferent to the king's will, began reclaiming what had been sealed. In the final year of his reign, a massive storm swept through the desert, flooding salt pits and dissolving entire tombs. Bodies once preserved in eternal silence returned to dust. When the storm cleared, travelers found the palace deserted. Only traces of salt covered the throne where Akar-Nesut had once ruled. Historians later called him the Salt King, a ruler who sought eternity through preservation but was consumed by the very substance that symbolized his power. His tomb was never found, only scattered layers of salt where the desert met the Nile, marking the end of a kingdom that tried to outlast time itself. Subscribe for more.